friends, so much for joining us for another Sugar Lime Blues Sunday Shoutout. This is Dave. I'm Ashley of Sugar Lime Blue, and this Sunday Shoutout is a retro Sunday Shoutout going back out to Michael Chavez. Michael, we hope you re-enjoyed your shoutout, and everybody will see you next week with another one. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, ring that bell so you never miss a shoutout, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Shout out. Hey, I picked a guitar that matches my shirt today.
Well, tell me a little more about this string tree, because I had never noticed one. Do you have other guitars that have a string tree?
Usually Strats and Telecasters have string trees.
I've never noticed one before.
So it's this little guy right here. So what happens is the string comes over, and if it was just going out so far where it's longer, it only goes down like so fast. Like it's not tapered down enough.
So is that actually pulling the string down a little bit?
So it pulls the string down sharper. Like see if I take it off of there, like see how it comes up higher? Like without the string tree, that's what it would be. And then see what would happen if I bend, then this can slip up out of here. See how loose that was? So it just comes right out. So
and that's not what we want.
That's not what I want, because like you can be playing solo, you know, like going along, playing your little solo, and then all of a sudden, you know, your string's down there, and we're like, where's my string gone?
And you think it's broken?
Yeah. Which, you know, so not good. So like this puts a little downward pressure on it. That way it keeps it from slipping out of the nut there. So
does it ever slip off of there kind of on its own?
Not on this guitar. Like I think that really helps. Like some guitars I've had it where maybe it's not slotted out quite far enough and it'll slip out, you know, because you'll be playing and you'll be like, where does my string go? I broke a string. But then you realize afterwards that, oh, maybe you got, sometimes like guitars, if they're not set up and playable, like they can get caught under the frets when you're playing. Like you're playing chords and then like it'll just stick like that and you'll be like, where's my string? So that's something that happens. Of course, breaking. I've had one guitar in the past where it's stuck under the pickup or came off the saddle. Okay. So it's important, make sure everything's set up right and everything. But this guitar is a Fender. Good match. Fender Telecaster made in Corona, California. Which is, also, like, I like jazz.
I do too.
I heard yesterday, and I don't know if this will make the cut of the, we'll probably cut it by now. But anyhow, I heard that they were talking about how all the studio musicians used to be jazz players. Which makes sense, right? Because they were saying that, and this is where music has changed so much, like since the 70s, I think, and 60s and 70s, that they sign all these bands, and back then rock bands and country bands and basically all musicians, they wanted to improvise. Like they all wanted to improvise, like we do live, and it was like, that's a big thing. And the studio guys, they would hire them in because they were such good improvisers, because that's what they do a lot in jazz, is they'd follow, they have the standard and then they do their own interpretation over it, and it could be different every single night they play it.
Yeah.
So much like we do with our originals and covers when we play live. But, so they would hire all these jazz musicians, and they were expected to, like, pretty much, like, record it in one take, because, like, tape was so expensive back then, and those were the best musicians you could get in.
So it still goes back to money.
Right, so like it did go back to money. So then they would have all these jazz guys, and then maybe they didn't like the feel or something, but they were always put on the spot to like, okay, we want like that but the opposite, or we want like that but more with an upswing, or like swing it more or swing it less, or play it more straight, and all this stuff. And they were expected to just be able to be like, okay, I can adjust to that. Okay, I can adjust to that. Okay, now play a solo, or play a lead over this part, or play like, we want a little melody line here, counter melody to the piano. And these guys could really do it, And the dawnings of early rock and roll, you had a lot of these standouts, like Glenn Campbell was a major studio musician. He'd come in and just like do it in one take.
So let me ask you this: a studio musician from that time, from the 60s, 70s, early 80s, was a studio musician, a musician that was attached to a studio. Like, if you went to...
record labels, yeah.
Yeah, like if you went to a specific studio, they have their kind of call sheet.
They had their guys, and not only that, they had their, they had their call sheet, and they had their group of guys, and they're probably a lot, to this day, I think, probably runs a lot the same way. But then, like, there was a change in the early 90s, and everybody attributes it to Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, because all of a sudden,
grunge movement.
All of a sudden it was, we want simple.
Yeah.
Like, we don't want, like, complex. Like, we don't, like, everything got, like, kicked back to, like, reset, And then shortly after that, in the early 2000s, there was no budget to make music anymore. So, like, a lot of times it was...
to now.
Yeah, right. So a lot of times it was the producers, like the producer that produced it, or the engineer, or whoever mixed the record. They have to be multi-instrumentalists as well. So you run into a lot of guys that could play guitar, play drums, play bass. Yeah. And, some of these guys that did this, they went uncredited, or the drum, because it's always been a big deal to, like, make the band look like they're the standouts and the superstars. Yeah. So a lot of these records, even in those times, like, it was a big movement to hire these guys that had a certain look. Like, they had, like, that kind of, like, jock look, and they were, like, pretty boys, and they had a couple songs, maybe, but they weren't, like, super proficient on their instruments. So they'd record, but then a lot of times it was this producer who was playing all the tracks.
That's wild.
And they said almost always the drummer was replaced, and almost always the guitars were getting layered, and most of the time the bass, and they would have to recut all this stuff. But then in the liner notes, it wouldn't say, like, that the producer was the player because he's already getting credit for one.
Right.
They want to make the band look good for two, and a lot of times it didn't come out 2 years later. And if they did get credited, like sometimes, like, because Kenny Aronoff was a big drummer that played on a lot of these records too, and especially in the late 90s, early 2000s. So he'd play on a ton of these records uncredited, but like once people knew who he was, it was apparent that he played on the record because a lot of times it would say like special thanks to Kenny Aronoff.
Well, you can also
like,
you learn to hear a voice thing
right.
too. You kind of learn
you learn what they sound
styling.
like,
Yeah.
and you're like, how, like, why are you thanking Kenny Aronoff on a record?
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's like, oh, he's like a famous. Now he's a famous drummer, but at the time it was kind of like, you know, the average person, and maybe even today, the average person wouldn't look and be like, special thanks to Kenny Aronoff. They wouldn't think twice about it.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
nowadays
who
people
even
don't
reads
read
the
liner notes anymore,
like
right?
You listen on Spotify. Who even
right? So nobody knows anymore, and it's still a lot of the same stuff where a lot of stuff's just made in the studio. One person's playing all the stuff, but it's been a big part of the sterilization of records too, because they haven't had the budget to bring in some of these players. I mean, like in those days, in their 60s and 70s, Glenn Campbell was on hundreds of records, like with the Cutting Crew, but they were able to sound different from album to album. You know, even Duane Allman got his start in early days with he was cutting records in Muscle Shoals.
Well, where was the Wrecking Crew located? They were out in California, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked that documentary a lot.
Yeah, they were good.
Well, the Muscle Shoals documentary was good too.
Yeah, it was really good also. But yeah, like a lot of these guys, you know, the musicianship in the studios isn't what it's like because nobody has the budget now. And people are thrown together so ezy to put out a record with no.
It is not
effort.
easy to put out a record.
It's so easy to put out a record. It's not easy to put out a good record, you know. So it's tough. It's a different thing, you know. And there's also no budget to hire in those people that say like, oh yes, no, or maybe this would be a good idea, or maybe that would be a good idea. You know, it's all left up to one person, and that's not always the best.
Yeah. Well, you get the same idea over and over again.
You do.